We're going to take a very unique look at how it is that we as Jewish people make an impact on this world and bring an awareness of Hashem into the world, transform the world, by using the example from this week's parasha of how Eidim, how witnesses work, specifically when we learn that there are two different kinds of witnesses. In the minion from Eidos, when it comes to the concept of testimony, the pasuk tells us, Al Pishnei Eidim Gomer, with two or more witnesses, Yakum Davar, a fact will be established. So, Gefin Ben Tzvei Sugim, turns out that there are two kinds of witnesses. Aleph, the one kind is called Eidei Birur, witnesses whose job it is to clarify a situation. Le Dugma, for example, Eidosof Halva, let's say you have witnesses to the fact that a particular loan took place. Is not to their job is just to clarify for us that the loan actually happened. Whereas the loan itself is nit abhängig in the Eidim, doesn't need the witnesses in order for it to be a loan. Theoretically, if somebody lent money to another person without witnesses, the debtor is required to pay the creditor. You don't need witnesses in order for that to happen. So the fizeh that taich von apishne edim gomi yokum dover. So in the context of Eidei Birur, witnesses who clarify a fact, when the Torah tells us that based on their testimony, the facts will be established, what that means is, as the dover wird festgestellt durch die Edim. It means that it's consolidated, it's clarified, it's absolutely rock solid because you have witnesses who can illustrate to us what happened. But what happened even without the witnesses. Whereas the second type, Beis, is Eidei Kiyum. They are witnesses who cause the event or the entity to become, to happen. Le Dugman, the best example for that is Eidei Kiddushin, the witnesses to a betrothal at a wedding. Eidus is a tale fundi Kiddushin. They don't just testify to the fact that Kiddushin happened, they make the Kiddushin happen. Without the witnesses, there would be no marriage. For the din is, and the halacha clarifies this because we're told as afilu and side ish that even if you have a man and a woman who both acknowledge as given, he gave me a ring and we got married. If there were no witnesses to that action at that time, is the halacha as ein chosheshin lekiddushin. The halacha is we completely disregard their testimony, the husband and wife. There are no witnesses. There is no wedding. They'll say, in other words, as on Eidei Kiddushin is nitokin Kiddushin. So without witnesses, there is no marriage. That's called Eidei Kiyum. And by dem sug Eidus is the Pirush von Yokum Dover. In that context, when the Torah says that based on the testimony of witnesses, the facts will be established, that means durch ze wird aufgetan der Dover. That doesn't just mean that they will clarify what happened, rather they make it happen. Okay, so two kinds of witnesses: Eidei Birur, clarify an event that occurred or a transaction, etc. Eidei Kiyum, make that particular event or transaction occur. Now that has practical applications because mitzadim chilek hanal komtaros noch hanafkim zwischen Eidei Birur und Eidei Kiyum. We're going to see a practical difference between the two types of witnesses. By Eidei Birur, when we're talking about witnesses whose job it is just to clarify for us what happened, seeing as that's their job to clarify the details, when do they actually become witnesses? At the time that we need to clarify the information, because that's their job, to clarify information. And practically that means that's when they appear in front of the courts in order to testify, in order to clarify the information. That's when they become Eidim. That's when they have an impact. Mashenkin by Eidei Kiyum, whereas the witnesses that cause the event to happen, like the witnesses to a wedding, because their job is to make the thing happen, in this case the marriage. So as soon as they see the man put the ring onto the woman's finger, that's when they become Eidim. That's when they play their role. Now that's relevant because it's going to have a practical application in how we test these witnesses to see if they are in fact valid. That's why the Rogatchover explains why we don't cross-examine witnesses who say they saw a wedding. Because when do you have to cross-examine witnesses? Only when you're dealing with witnesses with the Geder Eidos Vert Baze Beiker in und durch Beis Din. where the entire nature of their testimony is all in the context of the courts. So now these witnesses appear in front of the courts have to cross-examine them to see if they're actually believable witnesses. So they need edus side and beis din. They cannot be considered witnesses until the beis din has established their credentials and the veracity of their story by cross-examination. Whereas witnesses who are edei kiyum, like the witnesses to a marriage, the Torah has already established their credentials for them by considering them edim when the event happened, when the marriage happened. So therefore, we don't need the beis din now to cross-examine them. They already have their credentials. We don't need the beis din to check them and then verify them so that they should become edim. They became witnesses with all the power of witnesses at the time that they saw the kiddushin happen. So Eidei Birur, Eidei Kiyum, two different types of witnesses. They come into play at different stages. Eidei Birur in the courts, therefore they have to be established by the courts through cross-examination. Eidei Kiyum when the event happens, and therefore the beis din doesn't really have any sway over establishing their credentials. So now with that information, as Eidos Zayin and Atel from Maaseh HaKiddushin, that when there are witnesses to a marriage, they actually make the marriage happen. Zayin Mekayim de Kiddushin. So, based on that, we can explain another area of halacha that applies to marriage. The Gemara in Nedarim speaks about what happens if a person makes a statement, and then in a span of time that is called toich kedei dibur, which is pretty much as long as it would take to greet your Rebbe, they retract. So that's something we have to consider in all cases, but not in the case of marriage. The Gemara says, the halacha is that if a person retracts immediately after making a statement that is considered part of their statement, chutz, with the exception of a person who speaks out against Hashem, or mekadosh and megorish, or people who either marry or, God forbid, divorce. So the question is, why would marriage or divorce be different to everything else where you don't have the opportunity to retract what you have said? So first we'll look at an explanation from the Ran. The Rebbe will explain that we need to truly understand what the Ran is saying because it doesn't seem so clear at first. The Ran is Masbir, as Bashar Mili Delocha Miracle Ahai. So the Ran says all other areas of testimony, usually the stakes are not so high as they are in marriage, where you're talking about potential things like adultery or mamzerus. So therefore, the person who gets involved in the particular transaction, either as the person, the actor, or as the witness, they go in with an attitude which is that if anything goes wrong, they can quickly retract straight after they've made the statement. Whereas by things that are so strict, like marriage and divorce, because they're such serious issues, person would never get involved in the first place unless they were absolutely certain that they wanted to go ahead with this. So therefore you can't change your mind even immediately afterwards because you went in wholeheartedly and you absolutely committed to this particular action, the marriage or the divorce. That's how the Ran explains it. And the Rebbe says, we really need to understand what the Ran is saying. Because if we go with this logic, that in anything outside of marriage and divorce, a person hasn't absolutely committed to whatever they're saying or doing until a period of time has elapsed, then there should be a practical application of that. That whatever the action is should not be considered complete until the time has elapsed. And here's a practical example. Let's say, for example, let's say that somebody gives another person a gift, and the gift happens to be food. So by the Ran's argument, a gift we've got to wait and see, give him a few seconds, just to make sure that he doesn't say, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to give you the gift. So now, theoretically, the person gives a food gift. Logically, the recipient should not be allowed to eat that food, at least in the ideal scenario, until he should have to wait, see, did the appropriate time elapse that the giver of the gift could have changed his mind. Only after he doesn't change his mind, then I could have the food. Nobody in the entire halachic world suggests that this is an issue we have to be concerned about. So is the Ran really saying that people don't commit to an action unless it's a really serious issue? So we have to say, we have to conclude that any action is always complete at the time that you do it. And we don't start second-guessing people's intentions. No, ad kidei dibur, it's just that until the person has let that period of time elapse where he could have added an addendum, a disclaimer, during that short window of time, the person still has the ability to express regret, and through that, cancel whatever the action or the agreement was. And that won't happen, that cannot happen in the case of either marriage or divorce, because those are things where the Eidos already established the credentials immediately, and you don't have a chance now to undo it. As we'll explain now, is the Birund, and the explanation is by Kiddushin veGerushin, because in the case of marriage, which is the one we're focused on, but it also works for divorce, but the Maisa Kiddushin ufkiton durch die Eidos, as we've already explained, those witnesses are Eidei Kiyum. So as soon as they testify, as soon as they just see the ring go into the finger, that's it, the marriage has happened. And therefore, so the man who gave the ring, wanting to marry this woman, or gave the get, wanting to divorce her, no longer has the power to retract because it's out of his hands. Those witnesses, seeing it happen, have already established and consolidated the reality. Whereas other areas of halacha, where the witnesses, like the case of the loan, the witnesses don't make the loan happen, they just see that a loan has happened. And therefore all of the power lies in the hands of the person giving the loan or the gift or whatever it is. So therefore he retains the power within a short window of time to change his mind and to retract. Now, we're going to focus not so much on the halacha at this point, but more the spiritual message of these kinds of edim, edei birur versus edei kiyum, and what they mean to us. Whatever expresses itself in the revealed parts of Torah, like halacha, is a match to how these things are in the spiritual realms too. Therefore, as move on, we can understand as that the four concepts we have just learnt about Eidos, namely, Aleph, the fact that the two kinds of witnesses who clarify information and witnesses who make things happen. And specifically that when it comes to marriage, those kinds of witnesses make the marriage happen. And Gimel, thirdly, as Eidekim verim b'shas hariyah on Eidebir b'shas Eidesogen and Besdin, that the big difference practically between when the witnesses who are Eidekim kick in is when they see the event happen, as opposed to Eidebir who only kick in when they appear in front of the Besdin. And lastly, the fact that if something is done in front of witnesses who make it happen, like a marriage, that is a much, much more powerful kind of event and testimony. All of those facts, they all have a relevance in the spiritual and the deep understanding of Torah. And to understand that, we've got to say, who are the witnesses that we should be talking about? We're going to quote a pasuk from Yeshaya. We're going to see there's two interpretations of what that pasuk means. They refer to the two kinds of witnesses, and they'll help us to understand two ways in which there is testimony to Hashem's reality in the world that we live in. So, steht in pasuk in Yeshaya says, Atem eidai ne'um Hashem. You are my witnesses, says Hashem. So, the Zohar says the two possibilities of who you is. Who's the subject of that pasuk? Aleph, one explanation is Ilein Inun Yisrael. It's referring to the Jewish people. The Jews are the testament; they're the witnesses to Hashem in this world. Or Beis, the alternative is Ilein Inun Shmai Ve'ara, that this refers to heaven and earth. Tichsiv, as the pasuk says, as we well know, Haidosi B'chem Hayom Es Hashamayim V'Sa'aretz. Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Jewish people, "I'm calling to witness for you the heavens and the earth." Okay, so two possibilities. Two types of witnesses. The fact that we have two types of witnesses, the Jews or heaven and earth, they will align with either clarifying witnesses or establishing witnesses, and we'll explain how that is. So the Alter Rebbe is Mavor Baruch. The Alter Rebbe explains in the Likutei Torah as Eidos is Shaykh Nor Al Dover HaNister V'Nelem Einei HaKol, that the whole principle of witnesses and testimony is to describe something that nobody else can see. Otherwise, why would we need the witnesses? If we could see it ourselves, we wouldn't need the witnesses. But if something is clear and apparent, you don't need witnesses, and it doesn't make sense to have witnesses. In other words, I don't need witnesses that it's daytime now, because I can look out the window and I can see it's daytime. We need witnesses to know, was so-and-so in such a place at such a time, because it's not happening in front of us now. Noch mehr beyond that, but let's even say there's something which currently we can't tell, we don't know. But it's something that by the course of nature will come to light. We don't need proper eidos. That's why, for example, in the case of certain scenarios, you can have a single witness, because we know that over the course of time we'll be able to establish the fact. So we don't need the power of two witnesses in front of the courts. Eidos is dafka if hadover hanelem legamrei. So the Alter Rebbe tells us the concept of testimony is only relevant to something we have no other way of clarifying. Nein ruchnis meint us that has a spiritual meaning. If demos is mechaya alle oilamos, the fact that the Eibusher brings the whole of existence into existence, makes it live at every moment. Veloshen hazer v'chassidus, which we call in both Kabbalah and Chassidus language memale kol olmin, that the Eibusher fills every dimension of the world with life. Davon kenedus nithoben. We don't need eidos. We don't need somebody to testify to that. Vados adover hanigle, because it's something that is actually apparent. V'shas mekutzik zu. So Dan Hoga was said to be developed very gefiert. When you look around and see how the world runs, you immediately detect that there has to be a force that runs the world, and we conclude that it's a divine force. We can work it out in our own minds. We don't need an aid to tell us this. Like the Pasuk says, when I examine my own body and understand how the body works, it gives me an insight into how the whole of creation works. And to spell that out, Chazal Zog, and the famous saying of Chazal, just like the soul fills the body and therefore keeps the body alive, so the Eibusher fills all of existence and that way keeps existence alive. So because that's actually a logical concept, that there has to be a life force within the world, to the point that not only Jews believe this, but even the righteous of the other nations have this faith as well. We don't need witnesses. So when we say Atem Edai, either heaven and earth or the Jewish people are witnesses to the fact that there's a God, it doesn't mean this principle. We don't need witnesses to tell us that there is a creator, that there is someone or a being that gives life to the world. That is actually self-evident. But not only that. But even to believe that there's a godliness and energy of Hashem that is completely beyond creation, which we call B'lashon Hazer v'Chassidus Sovev Kol Olmin. In the language of Kabbalah and Chassidus, we call it the encompassing dimension of godliness that is beyond all of the worlds equally. Even for that, we don't need testimony. We don't need somebody to tell us that that exists. Because yes, we're talking about a level of godliness that the mind cannot comprehend or grasp. Because Seichel is was is mugvel in der Agbolos von Welt. Seichel is something which is bound by the realities of the world. But part of the rational understanding of reality is to understand rationally that there are things beyond what is rational. That is the most rational position, to appreciate there are things beyond us. Which means once the mind has come to understand and appreciate that there is godly energy within the world, driving the world, keeping the world alive, the person will then naturally conclude that that can't be the whole be-all and end-all of what Hashem is. That He produces worlds. They've just got to be beyond that. And so therefore the person would naturally come to appreciate that there are dimensions of godliness that are beyond the world and beyond the rational mind. So therefore, even when you're discussing Sovev Kol Olmin, this incredible, infinite dimension of godliness, there too, you don't need a witness to illustrate this to you. Because yes, it's not absolutely clear. You don't look out your window and see Sovev Kol Olmin. And even using the full extent of the human mind, or even a higher intellect than the human mind, we would not be able to comprehend this concept. But it would fit into the category of something that will come to light over time, because as we've illustrated, the rational process must arrive at a conclusion that there's a dimension of Hashem completely beyond the rational process. And even if I don't know what it is, I do know that it is. And that's, therefore, I don't need Eidos for this. So Atem Eidai, either we or the Shamayim Va'aretz are supposed to be witnesses to what? The inyan von Eidos is a Fatzmusa Yisbarach. We need witnesses to the essence of Hashem. Was is Hecher Oich von Sovev Kol Olmin, which is so powerful, so deep, so profound, that it is as much beyond Sovev Kol Olmin as Sovev Kol Olmin is beyond our world, and even more than that. As in ganzen nicht begeder von Seichel. So Memad Kol Olmin, the fact that Eibishter powers the world is completely rational. The fact that we have to accept that there's a dimension of godliness beyond the world is also rational. It's a rational acceptance of something I can't understand. But Hashem's essence doesn't even have that rational basis to say, I know it must be there even if I don't comprehend it. Because the Eibishter's essence is fundamentally hidden, not just from human view, but from any existence. You're going to therefore need witnesses to reveal that Taka, Hashem's essence, exists. That Hashem is not just a creator and not just beyond creator, supernatural, but that there's an essence of Hashem which is incomprehensible. Punkt Ve'edus B'Pashtus, which is exactly like ordinary, normal testimony, is to made sein and arois bringen adovan elam legamrei, as the Alter Rebbe described. The purpose of Edus is to illustrate something we could never have seen or known. Likewise, Hashem's essence needs Edus, and that can play out in two ways. On indeed Tzvei Ofane Edus Hanal, which dovetail with the two kinds of Edus that we have already described. One possibility, Aleph Edei Birur, that the witnesses who testify to the fact that there is such a thing as Hashem's essence will clarify for us that it exists. In other words, as eine Nikbe geworden in Bria Edus, that they built into the system of creation witnesses, was weisen auf und seine Megale dem Keach in Seif was is do in Bria. And the role of these particular elements that Hashem has built into the system is to illustrate us and to reveal to us that there is infinite Ein Seif godliness within this world. That's the role of heaven and earth. Kayodua, as is well known, the Rambam also speaks about this, that the fact is the heavenly spheres, they live forever as they are. So the planets, the stars, whatever it is. On Oretz was kayomim b'min, and here on earth we have the experience of species that endure. So even though the individuals die out, the species perpetuate over time. So the fact that that can happen, the fact that anything can exist indefinitely, is not b'kerach in seif. That has to indicate an infinite force to allow things to perpetuate ad infinitum. On therefore, for which reason we could say that heaven and earth, which illustrate this concept of ongoing life, they clarify for us that there is an infinite source of life. Because there was no other way that you could have ongoing life. Eidei Birur, they clarify what's already there. But then you get something called Eidei Kiyum, where the witnesses make something happen, they create a reality. Seinen euch da Eidem, was sei is gegeben geworden der Koyach zu. Then there are other witnesses who are empowered with Kvayochel, if you could say such a thing, Mamshich sein Atzmus Yismarich in Welt. Not just to clarify that there is an infinite source of life, but to draw that infinite source into the world, into life, al derech v'edekim was tun of demaise, which is quite similar to the concept of edekim that make a reality happen. So they'll bring the reality into this world. Where, what, who has the power to consolidate Hashem's atzmos into this world? Only us, because we have neshamas that are part of Hashem's essence. Therefore, they have the capacity, they, the neshamas of Jewish people, through engaging in Torah mitzvahs, they have the capacity to draw down Hashem's essence into this world. So Shamayim v'Aretz tell us there is such a thing as Hashem's essence, Eidei Birur. Neshamas Yisrael, through the process of Torah mitzvahs, they clarify, they reveal, they draw Hashem's essence into the world, Eidei Kiyum. And das is the Tampnimi for was Eidei Kiddushin seinen Eidei Kiyum. By the way, that's the deeper reason why it is that specifically, what is the classic example of Eidei Kiyum, the witnesses to a marriage? Because the Tachlis von Kiddushin v'Nisun is Pru Urevu Gomer. The goal of marriage is that people should be able to have a family, to have children. When humans have children, that channels the infinite energy of Hashem into this world. Because the idea of Pru Revu, of having children, is to perpetuate the human family forever. So that's the closest we get to being infinite, by producing new life. In other words, through the process of marriage, we bring down Hashem's infinite essence into this world. And that translates even into the most practical side of the process as the Eidei Kiddushin and Eidei Kiyum. What kind of witnesses are those witnesses to a wedding? The witnesses who make a reality happen, the reality that Jews are supposed to make happen, bringing godliness into this world. So that's very powerful, but it does leave us with a question. Seeing as heaven and earth do illustrate to the world that there is an infinite source, what is so unique about what we do as Jewish people? Shamayim v'Aretz are testimony to the fact that there's an infinite God who makes everything happen. So what are we adding in Mamshech Zayin Atzmos Yisbarach Lamata by so-called bringing Hashem's essence into this world? So to close the Gebirn, the explanation is this: as we have identified, heaven and earth do testify, they do prove that in this world there is a source that is infinite. What they don't illustrate is how the entire created reality is essentially empty and nothing, and completely surrendered to and dependent on Hashem's infinite source of life. That you don't see from Shamayim V'Aretz. When you look out at the stars, you don't see evidence of the fact that there's nothing else besides Hashem. You say, wow, look at those stars. The Uftu von Eden is, whereas the impact of the Jewish people was tun of durch Torah mitzvahs, what we affect specifically through Torah mitzvahs, as on this Galaver we see Zainoid Malvadoi. We illustrate that there is nothing but Hashem. We illustrate, we reveal how everything is completely one with Hashem's essence. Let's try and understand that better. We're going to examine a very well-known saying in the Gemara Shabbos about the pasuk, how the whole world calmed down after Matan Torah. We're going to examine it, we're going to question it, and then we're going to clarify it. So the pasuk is Eretz Yara v'Shakata. The earth was afraid and then it settled. Says the Gemara, B'tchila Yara u'lebasoif Shakata. Initially the world was afraid and then it settled down and was quiet. What does that mean? Says the Gemara. Far Matan Torah is developed given in a matzah von Yara Farirkim. All the way for 2,448 years since the beginning of creation until Matan Torah, the earth was afraid for its future, for its continued existence. And obviously, if you're afraid of your future, you don't know if you can sustain yourself, that illustrates a certain weakness in your existence. So the earth was weak up until the time of the giving of the Torah. When we accepted the Torah, peace and quiet, everybody was okay. Because Matan Torah, in the Metzius von Feld, the giving of the Torah consolidated the sustainability of the world. Now there's a purpose the world can continue. Now, if you think about it, it's l'chera need to move on. It actually doesn't seem to make sense. The Metzius von Feld is doch Geshem v'chomer. The world is comprised of physical materials. Physical materials, which constitute oilam, which is from the word helem, to conceal. Physical conceals godliness. Und Matan Torah hat aufgetan nach alles in dem helem oilam. Und ois geedelt die Welt. Surely the giving of the Torah weakened that helem, that thickness of the world, that opacity of the world, and refined the world. Like the Gemara says, at the time of the giving of the Torah, the whole world went silent because it was kind of overwhelmed by godliness. So the helem, the concealment, backed off. And that's why only thanks to Matan Torah do we now have the capacity to take those physical, concealed dimensions of this world and elevate them and transform them, make them holy. So, wie sagt man, as nach Matan Torah is go geworden a Teike für Metzius ha'olam? Then it doesn't seem to make sense that the world was unstable before the giving of the Torah and was stabilized by the giving of the Torah. The opposite would make sense. The world should have been very stable before the giving of the Torah and then unseated by the giving of the Torah, because now it can't just be this blockage to godliness anymore. Even though it does make sense, it says the Eibishter hat masne given in Maaseh Bereishis, as we well know, that the Eibishter made a condition with the creation of the world, as im yisom kabbalat Torah miskayim, that if the Jews accept the Torah, you will endure. V'im lav ani machzes kam l'Torah v'avoyo, and if you don't, everything's going back to absolute chaos. That is a condition that was applied to the world. That is not the condition of the world. Let's say, for example, if a person had to give somebody a gift, and let's say it's on condition of X and Y. The condition doesn't make the gift bigger or smaller, stronger or weaker. It just determines whether you get it or not. But the gift is a gift. So the world is a world. And yes, Hashem said, if the Jews accept the Torah, the world will endure. But the world is a physical place that blocks godliness. And surely once the Torah is given, it's no longer that way. It should be weaker, not stronger. And even though we know that the first word in the Torah illustrates that the entire purpose of all of creation was to facilitate Torah and the Jewish people, but you could still say that is also an add-on, or a goal, or an aspiration. In other words, we could say, there's a world that is there to service something else, the Jewish people, the Torah. Of the Metzius from Bria Gufa is not Torah of Israel, but nobody is going to suggest that the reality and the nature of the world is Torah or is the Jewish people. If that's the case, surely the logic should flow as follows: as man gets to the Metzius from Welt Gufa, that with regard to the actual physical stature of the world, surely hot Matan Torah v'gatana chalishas in Metzius nita toikev. Surely the giving of the Torah weakened the strength of the world rather than empowered it. Says the beer in them, the explanation is like this. When you see a person, as die Kavonas v'tachas hapula und die Peula Gufa sein in zwei besondere Sachen. What you see with a person is that there might be an action and an intention, and they're not necessarily the same. The reason for that is because in the human world, when something exists in potential, that doesn't mean that it will ever translate into reality. The koyach is nit ein zach mit poil. The potential for something is not the same as the practical application. So we all know this because we've all had dreams or ideas that never came to fruition. Why? Because the koyach choser poil. Because the intentions that we had didn't necessarily automatically translate into actions. And using the same logic, the intention we have behind an action is not necessarily the same as the action itself, and that's why good intentions don't necessarily get us anywhere. That's not the Eibishter, it doesn't have that limitation. But the Eibishter potential doesn't lack the next step to translate into actual. The minute it's potential, it is actual. Und erfahre ist die ganze Metzius von dem Poel, der Koyach. So, in Eibishter's reality, the action or the presentation, the physical or the manifestation, doesn't have to be physical, it can even be spiritual. Whatever comes out, whatever plays out in practice, is the Koyach. It's not the result of the Koyach. And that's relevant when we want to discuss the purpose for creation. Because the intention of creation was that there should be Jews who fulfill Torah. That means that the truest essence of all of creation is Jews and Torah, not the physical. Huge mind shift. The reality of the world is Jews and Torah, not structure and atoms. And this has a practical application in halacha. Derfor gewinnt man euch bedinei ha-Torah. As man rechnet sich mit der Kavone von der Sache und nicht mit seinem Geshem v'chomer. That there are scenarios where we determine the whole reality of the scenario based completely on intention rather than on physical realities and dimensions. Ledugma, here's an example. Beim Din von Amoitzi Echlin Pochus Mikashir Bichli. Here's an example. On Shabbos, a person carries some food in a container outside into the street on Shabbos, but the food is smaller than the amount for which a person would be liable to transgress Shabbos. Potter Afalakli. So the halacha is not only is the person not liable for prosecution for having broken Shabbos, for taking that tiny bit of food, but even the big container, they are not liable for either, because shakri tefela loy, because the container is considered absolutely secondary to the food. Das heißt, in other words, it's a fascinating halacha. If you had to take the container on its own, it is definitely large enough to be considered transgressing Shabbos and liable for prosecution. So theoretically, if a person took the exact same container into the street on Shabbos without the food inside, they would absolutely be liable. But because we're dealing with a scenario over here, why is the person carrying this pot outside? Only because he is interested in the food. So his mind is focused on the food. And the pot is just an accessory. The halacha is that we take the physical reality, the dimensions, the weight, the mass of this pot and completely ignore it. It is completely accessory to the food. You could even say that the container is now actually considered part of the food, and the food is too small to be liable, so you're not liable for any of it. Because the food is smaller than the requisite amount to break Shabbos, that naturally includes the status of the container too, regardless of its physical realities and dimensions. Why? Because in Torah reality, the intention determines reality, not the presentation. Now, every principle, we started off by saying that a concept in Nigla is also relevant in Pnimius HaTorah. Now we're going back full circle and saying whatever is taught in Pnimius HaTorah is also illustrated in practical cases in Nigla de Torah, so we'll use an example as well. So this concept as the ganze Metzius from Welt is Torah v'Yisrael, this idea that the reality of the world is Torah and Jewish people, is something expressed in a number of places in the exoteric parts of Torah. Kol Panim Berem is at least alluded to, and we'll use one example of Dugma B'Tosfos, also in the Gemara Shabbos. So, not in the Gemara Shabbos, it's in a few places. Shabbos, Beitza, a few places. Okay. The din is, as Kshem V'Yein Surfim Kotchem B'Yom Tov, the halach is that we may not burn on Yom Tov something that belonged to Kotchem. So remember, on Yom Tov we're allowed to do Oichel Nefesh, so we're allowed to cook something for ourselves. But if something belonged to Kotchem, you can't burn it on Yom Tov. This is not Tzarech Govon, it's Tzarech Hedyot, because that is something which is designated for Hashem and has no benefit to human beings. So therefore there's no concept of, I'm doing something for myself which I'm allowed to do on Yom Tov. And a practical application of that would be that if a person had truma and the truma became impure, So they can't eat it, and now they are required, the kohen is required to burn it. Can't burn it on Shabbos. On Yom Tov, on Yom Tov. Fragt Tosfos asks, the halacha is that you may not eat the truma, but you're allowed to benefit from burning the truma so you could use it as fuel for a fire to cook food. Why don't we just do that? Take this truma, which is now tameh, which has to be burnt, put it in your oven, and light it to cook your soup for Yom Tov. What's done is in the nefesh, because then it would be under the category of things for personal eating, which is permitted on Yom Tov, and finished. On Tosfos Entfert, the answer that Tosfos gives is fascinating. Because this truma is also dedicated to Hashem, the fact that it could now have a function for an ordinary person is cancelled, is neutralized, is ignored. Therefore, and we now consider it as if the entire quantity of all of the product is all directed towards Hashem, and none of it can be used for personal use. Now, really? What is Tosfos saying? The fact that it has an allocation for Gavoya, for Hashem, why would that naturally remove any allocation for myself? Well, based on the principle we've just learned, it actually makes sense. Because the truest reality of every single thing that exists is Torah and the Jewish people. Then anytime you use something aligned with its intention, you use it to fulfill a mitzvah, then whatever external additional content or meaning or application it may have is irrelevant now. The mitzvah takes over. Once something is allocated to a mitzvah, that totally overwhelms the reality of what it is now. And so therefore, in this case, the fact that you're burning the truma, why? Because it's truma tameh. That's why you have to burn it. Because there is a responsibility towards the mitzvah. It's got to be burnt. Therefore, the fact that theoretically you could also use it for your own cooking is irrelevant, because the mitzvah content overtakes the content of what this item is as wood for a fire. In the same way as the content of the food that you intended to carry overwhelms the content of the pot that you're carrying it in. Now, if that's the case, let's go back to the question about whether or not the world is empowered or weakened by the giving of the Torah, and let's flip the question around. And similar to the original question we asked, but kind of different. The fact that, as we've said, the entire purpose of the world is for the Jews and for Torah, and that's the truth of the world. So did that only happen at the time of the giving of the Torah? Eretz Yara v'Shakata. We explain, why did the world settle down? Because the truest intention of the world is Torah mitzvah. So once that intention was assigned to it, phew, okay, we can continue. Who says it was assigned at the time of Matan Torah? Surely, if the intention of the world is Torah mitzvahs, that must have been in play from the beginning of creation. Take it by the Brias dos Irgansa Mitzias. Right from the get-go, that is the truth of the world. It's here for Torah and mitzvahs. So what did we achieve when we practically received the Torah? That's what put the world to rest, at ease. But it was always intended to be this way. And in Hashem's world, if that's the potential, it's obviously going to happen. So what shifted? It says the beer in them. To understand that, we've got to understand and appreciate really what is so unique about our contribution to the world. The fact that the intention for creation is to facilitate Torah mitzvahs, that's all in Hashem's reality, actually, as a kavona, as an intention. It's all in Hashem's reality. Because as we've said, in the Eibishter's world, there are no breaks, there are no gaps, there are no pauses, there's no buffering. It's natural. As Hashem wants something to happen, so it is in reality. But that's the Eibishter's reality. But from the perspective of the created beings, created beings have those gaps. We have those delays between the theory and the practice. They don't feel in a meaningful way, as the ganze from Welt, that godliness is actually the truth of the world. They might know it in theory, but they don't feel it in practice. The Tachlis HaKavona is, the ultimate purpose is as in der Bria mitzad Welt Gufa, to bring down into the world from the perspective of the world living in its own reality, via ganze Metzius is Torah Yisrael, that the world should know absolutely, without a doubt, that its full reality is just Torah and the Jewish people. Was dann wird Welt vereinzigt medikus begil euch mitzad Welt, and that will achieve the absolute union between the world and God. It's all very well for Hashem to know the reality. The objective is to get the world to know that reality. That's why the earth, the world, only settled down at the time of the giving of the Torah, because Torah, prior to that, there was no way for the world to obviously show or experience its connection to Torah, to Yidden, and to Hashem. On the far is the Geshem for Welt gewesen mit der Teukef, which is why at that early period of the world, the physical reality of the world was the overwhelming reality of the world. Like a pot that hasn't yet got food in it. Was the Shirai is like the Geshem for Kriken al Sifres, where you'll only look at therefore the size of the pot. The food is irrelevant because the food's not there yet. The innovation, the revolution of the giving of the Torah is that now there's the potential for the world in its own reality, in its own head, to see its truest self on the far is given shakata, and that's why the world only settled at that point in time. With all of this information, let's go back to our distinction between the kind of testimony that heaven and earth give to Hashem's infinite existence versus the testimony we give through Torah and mitzvahs. Because as the Medrash Tanchuma famously tells us, what is the Eibishter's ultimate desire? To have a home in the lowest possible reality. The implication of a home is where you can be you, without limitations. The Eibishter's essence can be revealed. Because that's what the Eibishter wants, that's what's going to happen. You'll be able to identify it in the fact that, look what happens. The world keeps going ad infinitum. Which, as we mentioned earlier in the Sikha, the fact that the world perpetuates and perpetuates is an indicator of the fact that there is infinite God in this world and you can see it. But on the other hand, because that is a reality that is determined by Hashem on high, you could actually land up with a reality that you have Hashem's infinite power, Hashem's infinite being, which is one reality, and heaven and earth, which is another. But the goal is that this home for Hashem should be in the lowest reality. That means accepted by the lowest reality, normal for those who occupy the lowest reality. To get there, for that you need our efforts of Torah and mitzvahs. We change the world. We cause the world to accept godliness as the absolute reality from its perspective, not superimposed by Hashem's force. Das is the Asbar b'pnimius so inyonim, which, by the way, also helps us to explain on a deeper level was Eidei tun of Atekef and the Maisa Kanal Sif Gimel. Why Eidei actually make the action happen, make it stronger. Durch die Eides von Eden wird aufgetan Atekef and the Bria Shakata Kanal Barucha, which aligns with, as we already mentioned before, how when we testify to godliness in this world, in other words, we embed godliness into the fabric of the world itself, that settles the world and gives it, Toikef gives it strength, like Eidei Kiyum gives strength to a particular event. Der mit with all of this information can we can explain the difference we noted earlier between the two types of witnesses. As Eidei Kiyam Veren Eidus B'Shas De'Re'iyah, that if you are Eidim who make the thing happen, then your status as a witness happens when the event occurs. On Eidei Birur Esh when sie made in Bezdin, whereas the witnesses only clarify information, only become witnesses when they appear in the courts and they're cross-examined and their testimony is accepted. We can understand that from a deeper perspective. The Eidus von Shamayim V'Aretz Atzmom is nicht megala mamshich atzmusis borchen Welt. The fact that heaven and earth testify to Hashem's infinite being does not guarantee that will seep into the reality of the world. Because heaven and earth are part and parcel of the world. That means to say they are constructed in the reality of blindness, of concealment. Das, was der Kirche in Seif drückt sich aus in Shamayim V'Aretz, is es nicht mitzad Zeir Metzias, nor mitzad Elikus. The fact that there's godliness that you can witness running through the veins of heaven and earth is not because heaven and earth make that happen. It's because Eibishter makes that happen. And we as Jewish people know how to see that when we look. Und der Pfarrer noch dem Beide sagen bleibt und der Pfarrer ich noch dem Beide sagen bleibt dazu sich Baruch Adav Nelem Legamrei. So therefore, they give their testimony, they acknowledge that Hashem exists, that Hashem is infinite, they illustrate it through their ongoing existence, and they could still leave us with questions. And that's why people look at the heavens and they don't necessarily believe absolutely in godliness. When will you have the ultimate experience of clarity, the kind of clarity that witnesses are supposed to produce? That's going to happen when Mashiach comes. When the world will reach its apex. When we'll see clearly godliness in the flesh, meaning using our physical eyes. And then it's going to change. Then whatever is illustrated theoretically by heaven and earth, and the fact that they endure forever, will actually become clear, compelling. Okay, so that's the reality of Shamayim V'Aretz. Shamayim V'Aretz don't really illustrate clearly what's going to happen until a later point in time. We get in front of the Beis Din when Mashiach comes, and now we know that the testimony is clear. But the testimony that we create, the evidence that we give to Hashem through Torah and mitzvahs is very different. The fact that we bring Hashem's essence into the world through our performance of Torah and mitzvahs, that happens immediately. It's not deferred to the time of Mashiach. We do the mitzvah, and at that moment, we bring godliness into the world. Not just any godliness, Hashem's essence. When Mashiach comes, then we'll see what we had already done. It's not that the revelation has to wait for Mashiach in order to be effective. It is effective already now. We just don't see it. So far we've spoken about the concept of Eidus, how we give testimony to Hashem's existence. But the truth is the concept of Eidus and both facets of Eidus present themselves in how we serve Hashem as well. The most common way that people serve Hashem is with a rational basis. Anytime that we serve Hashem based on rational understanding, that is the equivalent of something which is clear and doesn't need eidos. Makes sense, so you do it. Beyond that, there's the possibility of serving Hashem in a super rational way. That's how we serve Hashem in a way that is linked to sacrifice. But the truth is, even Mesiras Nefesh is not necessarily at that level of Eidos. It is possible for a person to have Mesiras Nefesh that still has certain limitations of the rational mind. Person says, I will have Mesiras Nefesh as long as the Shulchan Aruch mandates it. So everything the person works out. Do I have to go beyond the letter of the law in this particular scenario? Does the Shulchan Aruch require it? The Hechster Avodah is the greatest way to serve Hashem is divos mitzad zugebunkeit von Eden zu Atzmus Yisborach, where a Jew has such a clear feeling of connection to Hashem's essence. Mitzad etzem haneshama, which of course is the result of the essence of that Jew's soul, is says nefesh on kenagbolus and on cheshbonis. That's where a person has dedication to Hashem without limits, without any calculations. On if der avoida state atem edai, that's what the pasuk is saying when Yeshayahu Navi turns to us and says, "You are my witnesses," says Hashem. That's how we bring Hashem's essence into this world, by having no limits in our dedication and commitment. Noch ein in dem. One more layer to this principle. We've already pointed out over here, so of course it's incredibly important that we have this dedication to Hashem that has no limitations. But we also have to realize that the obstacles that we imagine are not true obstacles, because what is the reality of the world? The intention of the world. Torah v'Yisrael. And any time that the value of the world is expressed, then the outer shell of the world falls away. Like the pot disappears, because the food is what counts. Is the Funda Hira that gives us a very practical lesson. Anytime a Jew has the opportunity or the responsibility to do a mitzvah, the Jew should not start to think about 1,000,001 considerations. The person shouldn't think about themselves, nor the existence of anything else out there. Because when it comes to doing a mitzvah, any extraneous imagined obstacles to the mitzvah fall away, because the ganze mitzvah is not the mitzvah, because the reality of the world is the mitzvah. So nothing in the world can impede the mitzvah. A person reaches a point of being aware of that when they're in touch with the Eidus dimension of their soul. As long as a person bases their Judaism just on what's rational, which is what we refer to Memale Kolomin, and understanding that the Eibishter has energy that fills and runs the world. And even when a person is committed to their Judaism in a super rational way, but the Mesiras Nefesh, that is calibrated by what we understand based on our learning of the Shulchan Aruch, which is similar to Sev of Kolomin. From either of those perspectives, a person could still take the world into consideration and feel disempowered. But specifically when we work with the power of the essence of our soul, which, as we've already mentioned, is directly connected to Hashem's essence, and the person can understand and completely integrate into their understanding that the whole reality of everything is only godliness, only Torah, only Yid, and nothing can get in our way, and we can succeed in our avodah, and through that bring Mashiach v'niglek Kvod Hashem to be able to see this with our own physical eyes. Take care from Yad Mamash.